Hey guys, just to be sure, I'm Tatiana.
And I'm Ben, just to clarify. Ich habe schlechte Neuigkeiten. Ich bin Engländer, wie gesagt. Also ich kann ein bisschen Deutsch reden, aber ich werde lieber Englisch reden heute. Also niemand ist perfekt, insbesondere die Engländer. Ne? So, let me switch to English. So what we're going to try and do today is convince you of two things. Number one, I'm going to try and convince you that there's three things that all of your CEOs should know about services procurement. And I'm going to ask you some hard questions. Some you'll be able to answer, some you won't be able to answer, but that's the point. And the second thing we're going to do at the end of the presentation is leave you with a practical framework that you guys can take away back to your own procurement practices to really evaluate your own services procurement maturity and get started to making that even more efficient than it already is.
So, by the show of hands, can you please tell me how many of your CEOs know the exact spend of the services procurement in your organizations? Anybody?
No one.
No one.
Oh, nearly. Okay, a little bit of confidence, okay. So the thing is, for us, we think that the primary role of the CEO should all be about generating value for shareholders, right? We could probably all agree that that's the role of the CEO. But the thing is, when you ask the average CEO what they spend on services procurement, where they spend that money, with which suppliers, and importantly, what they're getting in terms of return on investment from this really big chunk of spend, most CEOs won't be able to answer. So my first hard question to you guys as a group is, how can the CEO possibly guarantee that they are maximizing value for shareholders if they can't accurately describe what they're doing with hundreds of millions of shareholder dollars? So what's happened over the last couple of years? We've accelerated out of COVID much faster than anyone would have thought, right? We found it really hard to hire permanent staff, really hard to hire contingent staff, but business critical projects still need to get done. So what do? We lean on service providers to do that. They're obviously a lot more expensive. So when we look at some of the research, we find that Gartner recently reported that there was a 7% increase this year on service spend. They also reported that in IT services, that figure was even bigger. 10% year-on-year growth in IT services. Everest Research also supported this and said that right now, the average company spends 6 times more on services than they do on staffing, on contingent labor. So we've got this massive chunk of spend. It's really strategically important, but when we look at how it's being managed really poorly today. So let me give you some more statistics. Tatiana, if you hit it one more time, there's a statistic. Yes, there it is. So you can see here, for example, that most CPOs admit they don't have visibility or control over most of the money they're spending on services. I'll give you some more statistics. SAP did a report recently that showed that 75% of sourcing decisions are made without any kind of supplier performance insights or analytics. That's mad. I'll give you one final statistic. McKinsey just released a report that said that actually if companies focus more on how they're managing their services procurement, there is probably 15 to 20% cost savings available in that space. Right, so again, let's recap what's happening. Massive chunk of spend, growing year on year really aggressively, and really poorly managed. So why is it really poorly managed? That's the question we've got to answer before we start tackling the actual problem with a solution, right? So there's a couple of reasons why. Well, number one, services procurement is obviously very decentralized. So we have different buyers and different business units buying different services from different suppliers in different ways. So it makes it very hard for us as procurement professionals to get in between that process and start making it more efficient. Number two, it's a very emotive topic because Tatiana might play golf with someone from McKinsey, so she loves McKinsey. I live next door to a partner from PwC, so I always choose PwC. And so it's very hard for us as procurement professionals to get in the way of those relationships. And the third reason why it's so complicated to centralize visibility of this spend is because it's complex. Unlike hiring a contractor, when we buy a service, we have to define what goes into the project. We have to source the right supplier and negotiate the right price. Then we have to track and monitor all of the supplier performance milestones and deliverables. And then at the end, we have to evaluate whether or not we've actually got return on investment out of that engagement. So it's very easy to understand why we haven't done something about this yet, but now really is the time that it needs to happen. So for me, the reason why this is the first thing that your CEO should understand about services procurement is because we're spending loads of money, it's managed really poorly, but really importantly, there's a massive opportunity to do something about that, increase value, increase quality outcomes, and make our budgets go further, essentially. Tatiana.
Yeah, so let me talk about the second most important thing. And before I go into into this topic, I want to ask you, put your hands up if your CEO understands the full legal and financial exposure across your services procurement landscape. So, of course, we kind of expected those maybe silence in the room, because with the legislative changes over the past few years, across Europe, what we see more and more scrutiny on how the organization really procuring services, right? So we want to talk to you specifically about three types of risks: the financial risk, the legal and compliance risk, and also the contract risk. So let me give you an example of the financial risk. Now, it's a poor scope definition of your service, of your contract. So based on the PMI white paper that recently has been launched, 37% of the projects are failed due to poorly defined services, right? So this leads to the organization exposure, both from overstretching the budgets, but also poorly executed projects altogether. And this is definitely something that we see over and over again within our clients' organizations. So when you think about the way how you, so when you think about when you define your statement of work, you need to be sure that it's defined in such a way that your organization is not exposed to those financial risks. We, for example, use the contract management tool to make sure that all of the components of your services procurement contract is covered and very well defined throughout the process. The second type of risk that we want to talk about, this is the legal and compliance risks. And there are really two parts to it: the worker and the supplier. So when we talk about the worker, or the individual that actually delivers the service procurement services, most of the organizations really, there is no one tool that will tell you where they are, who they are, what access they have, how they have been onboarded, how they have been offboarded. The organization can't really say, do they actually have all the right certificates to actually deliver the service? Then I also want to address the elephant in the room. In German, we call it Scheinselbstständigkeit, but pretty much every country in Europe has some type of it. And when you think about it, many companies either ignore it or they really try to avoid it. But in reality, you just need to manage it, right? And I'll give you a really good example of, a company that we're working with, pharma production company. So when we came in and start doing the audit of all of their workers delivering against the services procurement contracts, we found a lot of solopreneurs, what we call them. And those solopreneurs, some of them were delivering on truly business critical aspects of the business. Like, I'll give you an example. Like in the production was somebody who was programming the software that's steering parts of the production process. Those people have been in the jobs for over 10 years, and they're the only source of knowledge around the space. So once the organization knew that, they could prepare the mitigation plan around it, but also they had a very good understanding of the value of the risk to the organization that was both known to CEO and CFO. So I would really encourage you not to shy away from this risk, but understand them and manage them well in the interest of your business. And then the last part that I wanted to mention is the contract part. So when you talk about the contracts, we've seen it a lot, especially in the COVID times, when the contract is not written well, or some of the clauses in the contract are not thought through, you expose yourself to additional risks, such as, for example, during the COVID, most of the contracts didn't have force majeure. Right, so you still need to pay your service providers, independent that they actually cannot deliver the service anymore. Now, I'll give you another example that recently we worked with a pharma company who asked us to audit their services procurement contracts, and we end up rewriting 67% of their statement of work. So all of the items and deliverables are better defined, but also the risks are really better covered. So I'll ask you again another question. Out of those 3 risks, do you actually recognize that you have them in your organization? By the show of hands. Yeah. Mm-hmm. So I'm glad. And this is actually, it's an exercise we're trying to make you after the dinner. So continue raising your hands. So another kind of number that we want to throw at you, that what we have seen in the past couple of years, that we have within within our master MSP landscape, so as the master service provider landscape, we see a big growth in the statement of work spend being integrated in those MSPs. So the question is to you, Ben, why?
Well, there's a number of different reasons. As we described before, services procurement is a very complex segment of spend to try and manage. It needs the right technology, the right amount of resources, experience with implementation and processes. And so obviously when you have an MSP on site already managing contingent staffing, they are perfectly suited to extend their services, if they're good, and help you also support service spend as well as contingent staffing spend. So let me ask you a really hard question here. So put your hands up if you know how your own services procurement process compares to your competitors. No hands. All right. So in that case, I'm going to give you 3 of my hardest questions so far. Number 1, if you compare yourself with yourself, how do you know what's possible? If you're only comparing yourself to yourself. Number 2, have you internally aligned and agreed on what best practice services procurement even looks like? And number 3, if you haven't done number 2, then how do you ever hope to achieve best value from your third-party service engagements? And I know they're all hard questions, but hopefully they're going to get you thinking about what we might need to do when we go back to the offices or back to our home offices and think about the opportunity associated with services procurement. So for me, services procurement represents an enormous opportunity for us to drive up value, reduce costs, increase speed and efficiency in the process. And for me, it can create a real competitive advantage versus our competitors if we do that. So essentially, if we can engage with, buy from, and manage our service providers better than our competition, we'll get things done quicker, at a better price, and we'll have a really powerful services supply chain that will do things for us that they might not do for our competitors, which is why I think it's really important. So, next slide, please, Tatiana. I promised you a practical framework to take away from today, which I'll share with you if you come up to me afterwards, to have a look at how we can all improve our services procurement process. So at Randstad Sourceright, we call this Services Procurement 360. And all this is an illustration of a best-in-class approach to buying and managing service providers. So as you can see, it's designed to be completely straightforward and not particularly new or groundbreaking. We have 4 different phases: define the work, source the work, do the work, and evaluate the work. And we have 20 individual boxes, each of which now, within Randstad Sourceright, comes with individual blueprints, standard operating procedures, and implementation guidelines. Now, we obviously use this to collaborate with our customers to understand where their strengths are and where their weaknesses are, and where we can help them plug those weaknesses in a really Lego brick simple type methodology. But you guys can also use this framework to go away and think about the extent to which you're doing these pieces of the puzzle. So, one really important thing here. It's important that you don't ask yourself if you're doing it. It's more important that you ask yourself to what extent you're doing each of these boxes. So again, I'll ask you some hard questions. For example, to what extent right now are you guiding and advising the services procurement process versus just administering and reacting to problems and raising POs, etc., etc.? To Tatiana's point that she was talking about earlier with contract compliance, to what extent can you today describe the amount of risk that's carried across all of your live SOWs? Do you know what clauses are in there? Do you know what clauses are not in there? Do you know the average payment terms? Do you know which suppliers are delivering against their milestones and which suppliers are not? We could help you with that. And I'll give you one more hard question. To what extent could you describe the actual return on investment that you guys are getting out of your third-party service providers as procurement? Because I would suggest that if you can't answer this, then this might be a really good place to start understanding what those answers might be. We'll whiz through this. So go back to the define one, Tatiana. Oh, can we go back? Oh, we can. Oh, you're good. Oh, very good. So let me just whiz through this to make it absolutely clear. So define the work starts with capturing the need up front. Again, we want to ask ourselves, how often are we catching the need up front and being involved in the sourcing, the commercial, the contracting decisions versus actually just administering it when the business is decided because the business is in charge, right? We're the professional buyers, right? So don't forget, we are the professional buyers that can add real value if we're involved up front. Then we talk through how are we validating that business need? How often are we pushing back versus just doing what we're asked? Are we consulting on resourcing options? Are we bringing supplier performance metrics to make sure all of these decisions are data-driven every single time? And then finally, how are we writing the SOW? We hear so many stories about SOWs being written on suppliers-headed paper or different emails or Word documents. We need to standardize and automate that process if we're going to drive efficiencies. Thank you. The source phase, you'll know all about the source phase. Again, this isn't meant to be anything new, but it is meant to be a simple visual representation and a checkbox so you can start asking yourself the hard questions. We're talking about identifying the suppliers, inviting commercial proposals, which means running competition. One of the other hard questions you can ask yourself is, to what extent are you leveraging competition in the sourcing process? What percentage of SOWs that should be using competition are not using competition? And what is the monetary value to that? What is that actually costing you because we're not putting enough SOWs through the competition layer? And then finally, it's about how we're evaluating. Can we standardize that? And then how are we actually executing and agreeing on the final SOW? The do phase is interesting because it's all about monitoring what happens after the contract is executed. 99% of our clients don't do any of this before we step in. So how and where are we actually tracking what the service providers deliver, what they're costing, who's good, who's bad, who's ugly, who do we never want to talk to again, and who is so brilliant that we want to promote to other areas of the business? How do we manage change controls? At the moment, probably in most of your business, a change control is done differently depending on the business unit or the hiring manager, and terms aren't updated, and payment terms are updated, and it's a whole big mess. We can standardize that process. The next one. And finally, the evaluation phase is about taking all of the data that we're capturing throughout that previous process and making sure that it's being baked into our future sourcing decisions. Make sure we're learning about which supplier is responding quickest, because we can track that. Make sure we're learning about which supplier represents the highest return on investment, because we can track that. It's also about how often we're conducting two-way performance reviews. I have endless conversations with customers just about their tail spend, who they say we don't need two-way performance reviews. And then we go through their spend data of their tail spend. And some of their tail spend suppliers are even getting more money than some of their key strategic suppliers. So we do need to sit down with our tail end suppliers. And finally, you'll see that last box there. It's about taking everything we've learned throughout the process to inform the future category strategy. So how dynamic is your PSL? When was the last time your PSL changed? Does it change every month? Or have those names, PwC, McKinsey, Deloitte, have they been on the same PSL list for the last 10 years? If they have, then I would suggest we need to apply a bit more rigor to whether or not they're changing, and whether there's new, fresher, better, more agile players that we could be bringing into the sourcing process. So again, if you're interested in this template, come talk to me afterwards, and I'll make sure you guys get a copy of that. Over to you, Tatiana.
So I hope you're really, really energized now after Ben's talk to go and do something about your services procurement. But before we leave this session, we actually would like to give you 3 takeaways. And first, what we call be realistic about where you are. What does it mean? We spoke with a number of the organizations who feels they're great, but once you actually kind of start looking under the cover, maybe you are not as great as you are. So don't beat up yourself. Look in the mirror. Say in terms of the framework that you see where I'm standing, what do I need to do, where I need to go. I think it's really important that you determine what is your starting point in the services procurement journey. The next one, focus on the real customer. And for me, or for us, also in Randstad Sourceright, it's really important point, because when we speak to the procurement people, and I think it was Christian was saying, like, we're both in this business for a very long time. Procurement people talks KPIs, savings, but ultimately you're buying this service because your business need it. So why your CEO kind of turn over to the services procurement? Why your business turning over to the services procurement? What they're trying to achieve from this exercise? Understanding how this plays a role in the overall business strategy of your organization, and then make sure that you are focusing rather on the desired outcomes than on the actual process and KPIs. Would you agree, Ben?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, so many procurement solutions are sold to procurement teams, which means they're built around procurement teams. Well, the procurement teams aren't the user. Obviously, we're all important stakeholders in that process. Yes, we want control, visibility, cost savings, but those things are all extremely uninteresting to the person with the budget and the need. So whenever we're building a solution, we're just really encouraging users to use co-creation as a means of making sure that actual engagement owner, the business manager, is at the center of it, right? And we always say the same thing. We always say, you can treat services procurement as a cost and a risk to be reduced, or you can start treating it as an asset to be maximized. And for us, it's definitely the latter. It's an asset to be maximized, that if you wield and capture the power of that external workforce in the right way, as I've said before, it could be a real game changer.
And then the last one, don't do it alone, right? There are plenty of the consulting companies, benchmarking institutions, companies, your competitors, your friendly competitors that has been done it before, or they may be in the journey ahead of you. Make sure that you actually have a friend on your side on your way to greatness in the service procurement space. So with this, we would like to thank you for your time, thank you for your attention, and then I think we still have a couple of minutes for the questions, if any.
Whoops. Are there questions? Just right away. Deutsch oder Englisch, whatever you like. Sonst, da vorne haben wir schon. Mikrofon kommt. Tanja.
Hi.
Hi.
And my question would be, is this a way also maybe to talk about reduction of personnel on the procurement side?
No.
Okay.
I would say no. Our solution has specifically been designed to be supplementary. So to fit in around your policies, your procedures, your people that have very important relationships. So our solution specifically is certainly not a complete outsourcing solution. We're not built to do that. We're built to take what you guys already do and what you don't do, what you do well, what you do poorly, and then to fit in around those gaps. So to plug the weaknesses and help you get better at the strengths. So I'll give you an example. For one of our big consumer goods customers, they need tactical sourcing support. They recognize that they need more RFX processes run. They just don't have enough people. So we step in and out when they need us to conduct those competitive bidding processes. For other customers, we're there on site because they want to, in the do phase, if I can get you to remember that, monitor and track all of the milestones and the deliverables, et cetera, et cetera. So it's really all about running workshops and discovery sessions to understand what you're good and bad at, and then also where you want us to step in. Yeah. But we would never suggest that it's a way of getting rid of your internal procurement team.
And I want to add something to that, because to be quite honest, in my entire career, I never met an overstaffed procurement department, right? So at the end of the day, while many organizations actually want to tackle this, they don't have enough capacity, just horsepower on the road to actually go and do and look and dig deeper. So most of the organizations ending up maybe managing about 20% of their suppliers that represent about 70% of their spend. But then what is with the rest, right? And do you actually optimize those suppliers who are representing your spend? So it's really complementary, and at the end of the day, very beneficial kind of for both, for organization, also helping the procurement department kind of not to do lots of additional hours.
Further questions? Gibt es noch direkte Fragen aus Ihrer Runde? Sonst würde ich mal eine Frage reinwerfen. If he's really the CEO and he really looks into this kind of stuff and starts asking you, what's your experience to really get him on that? So how would you approach the CEO who might not yet be interested in these questions? So how do you make that sales pitch for your transparency you hopefully have gathered beforehand?
That's a very good question. I mean, I would make it relatable to him. So why is it important to him? We've got most of the FTSE 100 in the UK or the Fortune 500 in the US. They're spending $2 to $3 billion on services. Now, that's a number that will wake up the CEO. So if you were the CEO, I might say, nice to meet you, Mr. CEO. We've never spoken before. You're spending $2 or $3 billion of service spend on services, but you can't explain to your shareholders where that's going or what you're getting in return from that. Do you think that's an important topic?
All right.
Hopefully he would say yes.
Well, so create the burning platform.
I'll throw another aspect to this, and I think it was actually really interesting a couple of years back when we worked with a big oil organization. So like, hello, Mr. CEO, do you actually know that you have about 5 million people working for you that are not on your payroll, and you have no idea where they are, what they do, and how they represent your organization, right? So it's.
Let's take that one step further. So if you really talk total workforce management and you get a CEO who might be as much interested as you suggest, how does that all fit into that? Because you're concentrating on service people, temp people, contract people, but there's all this permanent stuff. And I think we will get to some point where people development and culture and all that one needs to be for everybody in that firm. Otherwise you won't achieve what you want to achieve. So how does that fit into that? Do you get the same transparency? Do you work with HR? So how do you get that together?
That's an amazing question, actually, because what we have been start seeing in the market, that in the past, the organizations wanted their service providers or workers to be happy with the company who employs them and provide them to the company. Yeah. Now they want it to be attached to their brand. They want them to come and work for Google, for Philips, for Johnson & Johnson, because it's really becoming very clear for everyone. It's very, very hard to find people, and it's even more hard to keep them. So, the most advanced organizations actually do include services procurement as part of their overall workforce planning. It is still quite difficult from the technology landscape, but you can basically start from the worker, or you start from basically what is your strategic workforce that needs to be a permanent, what is your kind of core workforce that can be both permanent and either services or contingent, or what is your non-core workforce. And then what are the buying channels you can go through. If you look from the market perspective, we start actually comparing the data in terms of where the people sit, how they want to be engaged, and what are the rate differences. So the company can make a right buying decision. Anything to add?
And the same thing, more and more RFPs and more customers are coming to us now and saying, how do we monitor whether or not we are also the client of choice for the suppliers? So would PwC choose us over our competitor if there was two similar projects and they're paying the same price? So now all of a sudden those topics are coming to the fore, which is really interesting because people are obviously realizing that you can influence the suppliers, you can be a good client or a bad client, and they want to know how the hell we track and measure that. So I think that's a good sign that that's becoming more important.
Cool. I really hope so, because at the end of the day, that's the role of the CEO. And even if I've been playing that one, that's what they should do. At the end of the day, this leakage of skill is coming, whether we have it on the permanent side or the temporary side. Thanks for surprising insight into the CEO world, hopefully. Und ich hoffe, für Sie war was dabei, was Sie morgen an Ihren Vorstand und Ihren CEO tragen. Insofern, thank you so much.
Vielen Dank, Anna. Danke.